Greg Watson never doubted his wife, Marissa, not once in their 15-year marriage. But a sudden, searing pain while using the bathroom led to a diagnosis that shattered his entire world. Gonorrhea, impossible, he thought. He had only ever been with Marissa. The horrifying truth unraveled like a slow-motion car crash, one he couldn't stop watching. His devoted wife, the mother of his children, had been living a double life for over a decade. And Greg, he was about to make sure she paid for every lie. Greg Watson considered himself a lucky man, happily married for 15 years, 2 wonderful daughters, and a steady career. He wasn't the type to question his wife's late-night work calls or her frequent business trips. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, or so he believed. But all of that crumbled in an instant, triggered by a pain so sharp it made him gasp. At first, Greg brushed it off. Maybe a kidney stone, he thought. Maybe dehydration. But as the burning sensation worsened every time he used the bathroom, his concern grew. When he finally mentioned it at work, his boss took one look at his pale, sweating face and ordered him to urgent care. Sitting in the sterile waiting room, Greg had no idea that the test results about to be handed to him would change his life forever. "Greg, you have gonorrhea," the doctor said flatly, scanning his chart. Greg blinked, the words not registering. Gonorrhea? That made no sense. He hadn't so much as looked at another woman since he'd married Marissa. His hands shook as he repeated himself. "There has to be a mistake. I've only ever been with my wife." The doctor gave him a look Greg would never forget, pity mixed with something else. Resignation. He'd clearly seen this scenario before. "Then you need to have a conversation with your wife," he said simply. Greg left the clinic in a daze, the prescription for antibiotics crumpled in his fist. A dark, swirling storm formed in his mind. Marissa wouldn't. She couldn't. But then, unbidden, memories began surfacing. The late-night texts she never let him see. The business trips that never seemed to line up with her company's actual travel schedule. The sudden emotional distance that had crept into their marriage over the years. The moment he pulled into his parents' driveway, his mother knew something was wrong. They were devoutly religious, strong believers in the sanctity of marriage. But when Greg told them the truth, there was no judgment in their eyes, only quiet sorrow. His father, a man of few words, didn't waste time. "We need a lawyer," he said, already reaching for the phone. Greg wasn't ready to accept it yet, but the reality was undeniable. His wife had been cheating on him, and now he had proof, etched into his own bloodstream. Greg sat in family lawyer Gina Hawkins' office, his fingers gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had never imagined he would be sitting here, seeking legal advice about a wife he once trusted completely. Gina was direct, professional, and most importantly, unfazed. She had seen cases like this before, but even she raised an eyebrow when Greg told her how long he had been faithful to a woman who had clearly not done the same. "First things first," she said, sliding a business card across the desk. "You need proof, solid proof. Hire a private investigator." The very idea made Greg's stomach turn. Proof? Hadn't the STD been proof enough? But deep down he knew, confronting Marissa with only a diagnosis would allow her to spin a web of lies. She could accuse him of cheating, gaslight him into believing it was a false positive, or worse, make their daughters think he was the villain. No, if Greg was going to do this, he needed an airtight case. That night, Greg sat alone in his home office, staring at their joint bank account on his laptop. For years, their finances had been stable. Marissa handled most of the bills while Greg focused on saving for their daughter's future. But as he dug deeper, he found a hidden bank account with nearly $1 million tucked away, untouched by their normal expenses. His chest tightened. Where did this money come from? How long had she been stashing it away? A sickening realization crept over him. She had been planning for something. Using a phone tracking app meant for parental monitoring, Greg hesitated before typing in Marissa's number. His heart pounded as the app loaded. Seconds later, a small blinking dot appeared on the screen. She wasn't at work. She wasn't even in their city. The private investigator, a grizzled man named Roy who had seen it all, wasted no time. "Give me a few days," he said, slipping on a pair of sunglasses as he scanned the tracking data Greg provided. "If she's cheating, I'll get you what you need." Greg didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, an envelope arrived. Inside, a flash drive. No note, no explanation, just cold, hard evidence. With trembling hands, Greg inserted the drive into his laptop. The first file was a high-definition photo of Marissa in a hotel lobby, her arms draped around a man Greg had never seen before. The next was even worse, grainy footage of her laughing in a restaurant, leaning in close to yet another man. Then came the audio recordings. Greg's blood turned to ice as he listened. Marissa, his wife of 15 years, giggling as she bragged about her conquests. She wasn't just having an affair, she was having multiple, and she wasn't even being discreet about it. As the final recording played, Greg heard something that made his vision blur with rage. Marissa's voice, light and carefree. Oh please, Greg is too much of a boring religious loser to ever find out. Greg sat in the dim glow of his laptop screen, listening to the recordings over and over, hoping, praying he had misheard. But there was no mistaking the voice he had loved for 15 years, now dripping with cruelty and arrogance. Greg, that idiot has no clue. I only stayed because of the kids. Once they're out of high school, I'm gone. He was a virgin when I met him. I had to teach him everything, so boring in bed. Honestly, I don't even know if Lisa and Ginger are his. Greg's stomach twisted into knots. He felt like he was drowning, suffocating under the weight of her words. His daughters. She dared to throw doubt on their paternity? His hands shook as he grabbed his phone, his mind screaming between fury and despair. Lisa and Ginger were everything to him. Had his entire life been a lie? It took every ounce of strength not to wake them up right then and there. Instead, Greg drove to a 24-hour pharmacy and bought 2 DNA test kits. Back home, he crept into their rooms, brushing a gentle hand over their foreheads as they slept. No matter what the results said, they were his. But he needed the truth. Days later, the results arrived. Greg's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope. 99.9% parental match. Both girls were biologically his. Relief hit him so hard he had to sit down, but it was quickly followed by something else. A renewed sense of purpose. Marissa may have betrayed him, but she wouldn't take his daughters from him. With his mind clearer, Greg picked up the phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd call. Greg? Marissa's older sister, Loretta, answered groggily. Did you know? His voice was tight, controlled, but filled with barely suppressed rage. There was a pause, then a long sigh. I had my suspicions, Loretta admitted. Marissa always had a problem staying faithful, even before she met you. But I thought she changed. I wanted to believe she changed. Greg clenched his jaw. Even her own sister knew. As if sensing his turmoil, Loretta added, Listen, Greg, I love my sister, but she's always been selfish. She used to brag about how easy it was to manipulate people. She hesitated. I'm sorry, you didn't deserve this. A lump formed in Greg's throat, but he swallowed it down. That night, Lisa and Ginger sat across from him at the dinner table, their eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. Dad, Lisa finally said, hesitating. We kind of knew Mom wasn't always honest. Greg's heart nearly stopped. What do you mean? Ginger glanced at her sister before looking down at her plate. We saw messages once, years ago. I guess we just didn't want to hurt you. Greg felt the air leave his lungs. His own daughters had protected him while he had been blind to the truth. No more. The betrayal was complete, but now it was time to act. Greg had spent days preparing for this moment. Every damning piece of evidence, the photos, the videos, the audio recordings, was printed, saved, and stacked neatly in a folder on the kitchen counter. He envisioned how it would play out. Marissa walking through the front door, maybe with that usual dismissive expression she always had when she thought he wouldn't challenge her. He imagined the moment she saw the proof, the second the realization hit that her carefully constructed web of lies had unraveled. But Marissa never came home that night. At first, Greg assumed she was with one of her lovers, but as the hours stretched on, unease began to settle in his bones. Then around 2 a.m., his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the moment he answered, his blood ran cold. Mr. Watson? This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your wife has been in an accident. Greg's mind stalled. An accident? Marissa? His first instinct was to ignore it, to let her deal with the consequences of her own reckless choices. But then the voice on the line continued. She's in critical condition. You may want to come down here. Greg arrived at the hospital. His emotions tangled between anger and an unsettling sense of inevitability. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, a nurse briefed him. A drunk driver had run a red light, slamming into Marissa's car at an intersection. She had suffered multiple broken bones, internal injuries, and severe head trauma. The doctors had placed her in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling in her brain. For a brief moment, Greg felt nothing, just a strange, hollow detachment. But then, as if fate wasn't done punishing her, the doctor hesitated before adding, "One more thing. During routine blood tests, we found abnormalities that suggest possible exposure to HIV. We recommend you get tested immediately." Greg almost laughed, a dry, humorless laugh that barely made it past his lips. Of course, it wasn't enough that she had cheated, lied, and stolen years of his life. Now, she might have given him a death sentence, too. He sat in the waiting area for what felt like hours, staring at the stark white walls, his mind racing. The irony of it all was suffocating. He had spent weeks preparing his revenge, but in the end, karma had beaten him to it. Eventually, a nurse escorted him to Marissa's room. Machines beeped softly around her, tubes snaking from her body, her face bruised and swollen. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, Greg felt nothing. No rage, no sorrow, no love, just a deep, irreversible numbness. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wedding ring, weighing it in his palm for a moment before placing it on the tray beside her bed. Next to it, he set the folder containing every piece of evidence of her infidelity. The photos, the bank statements, the transcripts of her cruel words. Let her wake up to the wreckage she caused. Without a single word, Greg turned and walked out of the hospital, leaving behind both his wife and the life he once believed was real. The moment Greg stepped out of the hospital that night, he knew there was no turning back. Marissa was no longer his wife, not in any way that mattered. She had betrayed him in every possible sense, and now, as she lay in a coma, Greg had no desire to wait around for her to wake up. His path was clear. The very next morning, he walked into Gina Hawkins' office and said 5 words that made everything real. "I want to file for divorce." Gina, ever the professional, nodded as if she had been expecting this. "I'll push to have it expedited," she assured him. "Given the circumstances, you have every legal advantage." And she was right. While Marissa lay unconscious, Greg moved swiftly. He froze the hidden bank account, ensuring she couldn't access a single cent. He filed for full custody of Lisa and Ginger, citing her years of deception and emotional neglect. He rented an apartment, nothing fancy, just enough for someone recovering from an accident, and moved every single one of her belongings out of the house before she could set foot in it again. By the time Marissa woke up, her life had been completely dismantled. She called Greg's phone repeatedly, but he ignored every call. The only reason he saw her again was because she showed up, limping, bruised, and pathetically desperate, at their front door, a house that was no longer hers. Greg opened the door just enough to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Greg, please," she whispered, her voice weak, her eyes glistening. "Can we talk?" Greg let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "Talk about what, Marissa?" His voice was cold. "Your 15 years of lying, the money you hid, the fact that you don't even respect me enough to be ashamed of what you did?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I was going to tell you, I swear. I lost control. But I love you, Greg. Please don't do this." Greg almost laughed at the audacity. "Love?" He leaned against the doorframe. "Is that what you told your lovers too?" Marissa flinched. She knew she had no defense. "Can I at least see the girls?" she asked, her voice cracking. Greg exhaled sharply. He had thought long and hard about this. "I'm not going to keep them from you," he said finally. "But you'll only see them on my terms. No unsupervised visits. No overnights. You'll call them if they want to talk to you." Marissa's face crumbled. "Greg, I'm their mother." Greg's expression darkened. "You were supposed to be their role model. Instead, they had to protect me from you." The weight of those words hit her like a slap. She sagged against the doorframe, as if her body couldn't hold itself up anymore. Greg sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "This is your new address," he said flatly, handing it to her. "Everything you own is already there. We're done, Marissa." She took the paper with trembling fingers. I don't have any money, Greg. You froze everything. A sharp smile tugged at Greg's lips. That's where you're wrong. You have exactly half of what you stashed away. The rest? He shrugged. I took it. For Lisa and Ginger's college funds, you don't get to use money from our marriage to start a new life while leaving us with nothing. Marissa's jaw trembled, but she didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. Greg was awarded full custody, and Marissa, now jobless after her company discovered her infidelity, was left with nothing but the consequences of her own actions. Greg received the final confirmation he had been waiting for. His HIV test came back negative. Marissa's did too. A rare stroke of luck, but it didn't change the fact that she had gambled with both of their lives. And so the woman who had spent 15 years lying, cheating, and manipulating walked away with exactly what she had earned. Nothing. For the first time in 15 years, Greg woke up feeling truly free. No more pretending, no more walking on eggshells, second-guessing his wife's business trips or late nights at work. The weight of betrayal had been heavy, but now that it was gone, he felt lighter, as if he could finally breathe again. Life as a single father wasn't easy, but Greg tackled it head on. Lisa and Ginger, despite their own pain, rallied around him, proving they were tougher than he had ever given them credit for. They helped him with the house, filled the silence with laughter, and made sure he never spent a meal eating alone. One night, as they sat around the dinner table, Lisa grinned at him over her plate. You know, Dad, you don't have to spend the rest of your life alone. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. What are you saying? I'm saying, Lisa smirked, that there are plenty of women who'd love a guy like you. Responsible, good-looking, and not a cheater, Ginger added, making them all laugh. Greg smiled, but deep down, the idea of dating again felt impossible. How do you trust someone after everything? But fate had other plans. A few months after the divorce, Greg met Rhonda, a widow who had lost her husband to cancer. They met at the grocery store, of all places. Greg fumbling with a bag of apples, Rhonda chuckling as she reached for the same fruit. Their conversation started simple, casual, but something about her energy, her warmth, felt different. Greg took his time. He wasn't looking for love, but Rhonda wasn't looking to replace her husband either. They started as friends, sharing coffee and long walks, talking about everything except their past pain. And somehow, without realizing it, Greg found himself smiling more, laughing more, hoping again. Lisa and Ginger noticed. One evening, as he prepared dinner, Ginger leaned against the counter and gave him a knowing look. So, when are you taking Rhonda out on a real date? Greg nearly dropped the spoon in his hand. Excuse me, Lisa grinned. Come on, Dad. You like her. She likes you. What are you waiting for? Greg sighed, shaking his head with a smile. You two are way too invested in my love life. But later that night, as he stared at his phone, his daughter's last words echoed in his head. Before he could second guess himself, he typed out a message. Dinner this Friday? Just us this time? Rhonda's response came almost instantly. I thought you'd never ask. And just like that, Greg realized something. Marissa had taken 15 years from him, but she didn't take his future. He had won.